Well,
Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. And today we have the return of a very special guest, Professor Nicolai Petro of the University of Rhode Island, author of a number of books, and most recently of the Ukrainian tragedy, What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution. So welcome, Nick. Obviously, there's a great deal to discuss, so I'll just kick off with a general question. It's now almost 2 years since the start of the so-called special military operations, and I think most of us were surprised that 2 years later, the war is still continuing. So let me ask you, first of all, were you surprised by the start of the SMO on February the 24th? And were you surprised by the fact that it's taking as long as it is taking?
yes, I was surprised when it began. I was one of those who thought it was highly unlikely that Russia would invade. It just struck me that if such a scenario were to evolve, it would have been to Russia's advantage to wait for the assault of Ukrainian troops on Donbass. That would have put it, in my mind, in a better PR position. Absent that, I didn't think hostilities were likely, but I was wrong. And I think the reason, as I have mentioned before in interviews, that I made the mistake is I didn't appreciate the anger of and frustration of the Russian elite at the treatment it was receiving, had received, and was still receiving at the hands of the Western elite, a kind of totally dismissive attitude that hadn't changed from the 1990s to the early 2020s. As to whether it is a surprise that it's lasted so long, I haven't come to any conclusion about that. I haven't thought about that. It seems logical, given the extreme positions that the West has taken in condemning this military intervention, casting it as completely sui generis in the world, which of course it isn't. It's rather a natural, as John Mearsheimer and any other classical realist would have recognized. It was almost inevitable that Russia would respond. As Henry Kissinger once famously put it, no great power retreats forever. And it was bound to fight back at some point. But as to what surprises me, as it surprises a lot of Europe analysts, is the docile way in which Europe has bent to the will of the United States. As a number of people have pointed out, I think probably both you and Peter at some point have suggested, this is suicidal behavior on the part of European elites, who seem to have lost sight of the entire world because the United States basically blocks their vision, and it has created a total tunnel vision for certain segments of the European elite.
And on top of it, I think we need to stretch. I mean, there wasn't really much resistance either. I mean, you would have thought that, there would be some we had, when Macron visited Beijing, and on the flight back, he was saying all these things, and George and I made podcasts about it. I made a program about it. And then by the time it made it on air, oh, never mind. I mean, it's funny. I want to follow up on something you just said that I think is really interesting. You invoked John Mearsheimer, you invoked Henry Kissinger, which we're very well aware of what they thought, or what he thought before his passing. I remember the Cold War. All of us are children of the Cold War. Nick, what happened? What happened to that layer of people that were responsible, like ourselves here, a little bit of gray hair, knowing that the recent past, the distant past, there seems to be a huge shift that, there is no more prudence, there's no more restraint. And as the great late Stephen Cohen would always remind me, is that, Peter, you have to put yourself in the other guy's shoes. That is completely absent now. How do you account for that?
Around the 1990s, and for a generation thereafter, the number of positions in Soviet studies, or we didn't even know what to call it then. It was post-Soviet studies for a while, and then it was the former Soviet Union. I don't know what it is now exactly, but that whole there was a generation loss of specialists. And this is nothing new. People were pointing to it in our discipline. They were pointing to it with alarm. But indeed, we have perhaps no more than a third of the specialists that we once had. And those specialists that we once had were not all broadly trained. They did not all have the desirable expertise in language, culture, and history. Some of them were economic specialists. Some of them were agricultural analysts that happened to deal with the Soviet Union. A lot were military specialists. Those were all cut, and they were not replaced with anyone. Meanwhile, the remainder that stuck it through in the 1990s, many of them failed to get academic jobs or got academic jobs, but with teaching and research orientations that took them away from the area that they had trained to study, and they were now doing other regions of the world because they were in greater demand. So all of this led to a collapse in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, to a collapse of the study of that region. And we really haven't recovered yet, because, and I think eventually we will, because you can't understand a region without specialists to help introduce you to, again, as I would stress, the language, the culture, the history of that region. But right now we have people who are looking at things in methodological terms, and then additionally through the peculiar lens of postmodern studies and diversity initiatives, all of which
or democracy promotion.
Well, that's in addition, but we have a peculiar, I guess, the phrase in Russian comes to mind here, кастрюлеголовые, people who have helmets on their heads, unable to really understand what's being said to them through that barrier. And that's what I think of when I think of Americans who have been trained to look at the world, not just Americans, by the way. I've noticed now increasingly the same phenomenon in Europe. Look at the world through the lens of race and gender, which are all very superficial indicators of identity, and ignoring the deeper, lasting, and more significant indicators of identity.
I want to
follow up with a question to you, George. I'm hoping that Hungary is an exception to this rule, but I'll let you.
So far it is. Yeah, so far it is. We'll see what happens. Yeah. But just going back to Peter's point, I mean, one thing, I mean, you mentioned about you're surprised by the obsequiousness of the Europeans, but another surprising aspect is the extraordinary risks that the NATO powers are willing to run that they weren't willing to run during the Cold War. I mean, during the Cold War, so Hungary in 56, absolutely not. We're not getting involved. Czechoslovakia 68, absolutely not. Poland 1980, absolutely not. We stay the hell out of this. Yet now they're willing to take extraordinary risks. I mean, yesterday or the day before yesterday, we had this Russian transport plane shot down in in Russian airspace, with the use of, I think now it looks like American missile. That's really taking risks to an extraordinary level. I mean, how do you explain that?
It's been too long since the last war.
Yeah, maybe.
I mean,
We've got this from a German colleague we had on the podcast. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of the risk taking associated with the late Eisenhower, early Kennedy administration, both in the Bay of Pigs incident and in the Cuban Missile Crisis, was attributed by scholars at the time to the fact that it had been a generation since World War II and people had sort of forgotten what that was like. I think in addition to the time frame, there is the lack of training that I spoke of, and the sense of people who are, I guess, now at the height of their careers, but were being trained and entering politics at a time when Russia was historically at its lowest point in memory. And therefore, that becomes the foundation of the kind of relationship that they have. They had a dysfunctional understanding of Russia from the get-go. And now it's very difficult for them to rethink it because that's the Russia that they knew growing up. And how many of them have been to the country? I remember I have a whole slew of quotes by mostly congressmen or former congressmen who, you know, would say one thing, then they would visit Russia and go, my God, it's a completely different place. It's not, you know, falling into disrepair. There aren't, you know, people begging on the streets anymore, and all the things I thought were happening are not happening. I suspect that if you spoke to people in Congress today, their perception of Russia would still be that of 20, 30 years ago. And the way I highlight this to my students is I say, look at the rhetoric of every single American political candidate since the collapse of the Soviet Union. At some point or other, they will make the cognitive error of referring to Russia as the Soviet Union. Just
well, to be fair, I mean, one person I like to follow and listen to is Tucker Carlson. Everybody knows that about me. But he said when he still had his program at Fox, he said at one point, and I was just dumbstruck. He said, well, there's no financial transaction ever in Russia without corruption, and none of the escalators work. He said that on air. Yeah. Okay, and well, Obama said it. He's a smart guy. Okay,
right.
But he has
that. Seen the light. I think he has evolved.
Yeah, but Nick, can we just juxtapose? I find it really quite tragic and very dangerous how many people have suddenly are experts on Ukraine. Who knew? Okay, yeah. And there's this truly imagined country called Ukraine in Western discourse. I mean, before 2014, I traveled there very, very often, and I loved it. I really loved visiting Ukraine, particularly Kiev. It's a wonderful city, okay? And very, very charming, very kind, warm people, okay? But I saw what was going on, okay? And there was a lot of under-the-table stuff, okay? And a lot of kind of low moral stuff from the center of the city. I don't want to go into details. I think you know what I mean.
It's almost a national sport, I would say. To
get
one over on the man.
Yeah, but I mean, I always find it, I guess it's kind of the same side of the same coin. It's really remarkable how many people, if I were to ask you about what's currently going on in Portugal, you'd say, well, that's not my wheelhouse. I'm not that, Mozambique can't do that when they're, but you ask any pundit about Russia, of course, they're all experts on Russia and they're all experts on Ukraine. It's really extraordinary.
Well, that's simply a reflection of the fact that the conventional wisdom is widely accepted. And the conventional wisdom is a very narrow platform for understanding anything. Mm-hmm. So what we see is literally a reflection of the consensus of the mainstream Western media. So you wouldn't actually be able to think. Most people are not used to saying, well, everything around me is suspect, I'm not sure I can rely on it. That's a very uncomfortable position for people to be in. So they tend to avoid that sort of cognitive dissonance and go with the flow. This is an old psychological phenomenon that people have studied from the Stanford experiments.
Right. Just very intrigued right at the beginning, when you started answering my question about what you were surprised by, and you said you were surprised about the start of the so-called SMO, and you said, well, what I expected was that Russia would respond to an offensive by Kiev against the Donbass, and I think we kind of thought, yeah, that's probably what would trigger.
But there was
Russian
8 years
action.
of aggression against the Donbass.
Right,
too.
but an actual offensive, a la the Operation Storm in Croatia, which is what people expected.
Exactly. That was in the Ukrainian press for a year before that.
Right. So why didn't that happen? Why didn't Russia wait for an Operation Storm like attack?
I have no good answer to that. It would be sheer speculation. There are so many possibilities, ranging from strategies that were overthought and didn't have time to be executed on one side or another. It's like a multiple chess game in which you are strategizing all the possible moves of the opponent, to simply someone getting up one morning and say, to hell with it. Let's just do it. You know, in between those vastly disparate possibilities, you could imagine anything, including both of those reasons. You know, it'll have to wait for someone like Seymour, some insiders confiding in someone like Seymour Hersh, who would be willing to write it up in an interesting fashion, for us to begin to really understand what actually happened on an hour-to-hour basis, which would be fascinating, but only in a historical sense.
Well, I mean, I think that if we look at the lay of the land, the weeks before the special military operation, and it's one of the things that I've had to explain because it was explained to me, is that, you know, like for example, why it has the war after 2 years going into the third remained, you know, in the greater Donbass area all the way down to Crimea. And as a military person explained to me, he said, well, for 8 years, NATO fortified those lines and they were prepared for an offense. They weren't preparing for defense. They were preparing for offense. And that's one of the reasons why the war is kind of played out the way it was, because, I mean, what was it in the first few weeks? You know, the Russians fell for the trap, but once the Russians fell for the trap, the Ukrainians fell into the trap too, because they were prepared for a very different conflict. Okay, and then also, and it's very frustrating living here in Russia and talking to people about it, because obviously people want this war over. They don't want their young men dying, shooting down that plane of POWs. I mean, that's almost like a new low. I mean, that's when you just start saying, who's making decisions here? But, you know, I think something that George and I have had to struggle with over the last 2 years going into the third year is, and George very insightfully said, is that one of the reasons for the pace, and George is very frustrated with it, gets frustrated with me, but George is absolutely right. They don't want to provoke an all-out NATO reaction, okay? And the slow go gives them less reason to do it, okay? And plus, when you name all of the town, even I have problems pronouncing the names, okay?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. Well, there's two
it really
names.
is kind
There's
of
the Ukrainian
distant.
name and the Russian name.
Right, right. I mean, but you know, this in a way, because of the Russian forces in the initial part of the special military operation made it all the way up to Kiev, I think that was part of the diplomatic gambit, and it almost worked, okay? And then the gambit didn't work and they withdrew. Well, of course, that was Russia in retreat. I think there's been so many misunderstandings about that. And then ultimately up to today, Russia's strategy is working. It is sapping Ukraine of all of its resources, and most importantly, its young men. So, you know, as frustrating as it can be how long it's taking, they are achieving their goals if ever so slowly.
The danger of putting this conflict and seeing this conflict, the longer it lasts, the more it becomes an us versus them. And we begin to lose sight of how Russians and Ukrainians saw each other before the war. And that's a longer term danger for both sides.
Yes,
I
I
think.
agree.
I think it would be healthier for both societies to think about this conflict, or to reframe this conflict as a larger civil war, and to see it as one that both sides have, Russians and Ukrainians have a primary interest in resolving amongst themselves. And the sooner that the Ukrainian government, or forces close to the Ukrainian government or in the Ukrainian government, realize that the West does not have their best interest at heart, but is only going to defend and support them so long as it serves the West's interests, they need to be able to play, and I hate to cite Aristovich, but he's quite right on this point, they need to start playing their own game. They need to start playing for themselves. And in doing so, not just to wheedle a couple more $1 billion out of the West, or this new weapon or that new weapon, but to really begin to think about the role of Ukraine strategically in Europe as an independent power, because subordinate to the West or subordinate to Russia, it really does lose its its political identity and eventually its political will. And the country, the way out, I think, for countries in that position, squeezed between major powers, always the object of envious comparison and not letting the other side get it. The only way is to truly pursue an independent strategy and independent course, and to be neutral. And you can be a well-armed neutral state, as well, Switzerland, the obvious case, would almost be an ideal scenario for Ukraine, but it would take a very long time to achieve.
But how feasible is that? Because everything you're saying here is extremely sensible. Ukraine is clearly being used by the West as a battering ram. Their only purpose is to weaken and ultimately degrade and destroy Russia. The West doesn't care about Ukrainians or Ukrainian culture or anything else. So, but it's gone on for 2 years, and there doesn't seem, at least, as we perceive it, any leadership that could emerge in Ukraine will say, yeah, we have to think about our own interests. And, these people don't have our own interests at heart.
So we don't know the depths of Ukrainian politics, because we see only the permitted facade and what the media is permitted. There is a deeper layer to Ukrainian politics, and here I'm including the emigre population and the emigre political leadership. I was reminded once reading Nikolai Azarov, the former prime minister, who pointed out that there are 2 full Ukrainian government cabinets from different presidents residing in Moscow. So there's all the expertise there. They and others who have emigrated to the West now, there seems to be a coterie in the West, which is obviously, I don't think they're pro-Russian, but I think they are certainly interested in independent maneuverability for Ukraine. That is a resource that Ukrainian society will eventually tap. It's happened before. When Ukraine declared its independence, the first community that began to play a significant role in reshaping the political discourse were of course Ukrainian nationalists. Ukrainian nationalists descended on Ukraine from Canada and a handful of other regions, Germany and other countries, and they understood partly the lay of the land. But what they did was they settled only in the Western regions, because they weren't very well understood or welcome in the eastern parts of Ukraine. Nevertheless, and it took them about 15 years to really become a political force, but with the resources at their back, which were largely private resources at the time, no Western government seriously committed to the to Brzezinski's plan of, separating from Ukraine. It was a fantasy, but they committed their own resources to that, and with remarkable success. So nothing's going to happen overnight. But I would also remind you, as historians, we're all amateur historians, 2 years is nothing. The country still lives, Ukraine still lives to a very large extent in the cultural mindset of the previous generation. And there are loads of examples of this, including all the contention about the Russian language that explodes in the local press and on the blogs whenever in a predominantly Russian-speaking region, someone is fined or something like that. There's also the interesting phenomenon, I think this was picked up by Fred Weir in the Christian Science Monitor, this Russian film, Patsani, I think it's called, which is, phenomenally
a TV series. It's a TV series.
Throughout the former Soviet Union, including Ukraine. It's like everything is much more familiar there.
Yeah.
It will be a very long time, if ever, that the West has a cultural influence comparable to that of Russia in Ukraine. And
one of the issues that you've written a lot about, and we've talked about personally when you visit Moscow, is that, what do you do about the Galicians? What do you do about these people here? Because, I mean, if I can paraphrase you, I mean, there's, these are competing definitions of what it means to be Ukrainian, and they're at and for 8 years after the coup in 2014, that was put on steroids. Okay, and 8 years isn't now it's like getting close to 10 years now. Oh, it is 10 years now. I mean, that's a lot of propaganda. A lot of resources were pumped into it. Okay, how do you deal with that? Because if you have even if it's a small group of people, small percentage of people that are so committed to that project and resourced, how do you say, hey, we really need to have a compromise here? By definition, these people don't compromise.
When Kuchma, shortly after Kuchma, President Kuchma wrote his book, Ukraine is Not Russia, one of Ukraine's leading writers before his assassination, Ales Buzina, wrote a counter piece entitled Galicia is Not Ukraine. And he's from that region. His argument, which is well worth rereading because he's essentially a historian, he's what I call the Ukrainian Gore Vidal. He's a brilliant writer who writes about his history and possible alternative histories from a very solid factual and conceptual basis. So the issue of what to do with very tightly and narrowly self-defined subgroups within the country is not new. We have models to look at. We have Northern Ireland. We have Northern Italy, either Südtirol or Alto Adige, depending on which perspective you want to take. And there are other pockets. I was recently in Spain and was fascinated. I was in the southern Catalan region, so in Valencia, and fascinating to see how easily both languages, Catalan and Spanish, were prominently displayed everywhere. But the way in which they justified it was not, well, we want to be independent, we want to be separate so that we can defend ourselves. There is this element of we need to be able to prioritize the language, and they do. In other words, everywhere that you see a public posting, the first line of it is in Catalan, the second is Spanish, and then English as the third, and nobody has any problems with that. We were walking with a Spanish friend who was asking for directions, and everybody was perfectly happy with him doing so, even he was from another region, from the Basque region himself. But anyway, the point being that it can be handled wisely. And I was intrigued to read a local press account, which I thought would be a very nice way to phrase it for Ukraine in Spain. They said, it was a local politician, and he said, you know, one thing, we are we are nationalists. We of course take pride in our local identity, but we have to recognize that we shouldn't deprive the Catalan people of their Spanish heritage either. That's such a nice way of phrasing it, to say.
Yeah, but see,
you know,
you're what you're describing is a kind of a, and I'm going to use the word nationalism in a good sense. You have a cultural and social nationalism, but in Ukraine they've politicized it. Okay, it's about power as well. How do they get to a model that you've just described?
There are any number of historical paths. One is military defeat. That has happened with the Axis powers and their entire, after World War II, and their entire educational structure was redefined to eliminate nationalism, although as we are now beginning to see, that doesn't work forever either. In countries like Germany, there's always a rebound effect when people look back on their own history and ask, well, why did we give this up? Why did we give that up? Another is to offer a better social model, a more attractive economic model, and political, military, and social stability. If that could be convincingly offered, we have seen, and Galicia now was always the hotbed of independent separatist sentiment, at first against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then for 20 years against the Poles, and now against, after World War II, against the Russians. But these alliances, there were always alliances of convenience. When you were against the Poles, it was fine to be with the Russians. And when you were against the Russians, now it apparently is okay to be with the Poles. But the objective that I think strategically politicians and analysts should appeal to is the idea of, how can we make your dreams come true and encourage you to accept a placement in the world that is dignified and worthy of your contribution to European culture. Let's not make you an isolated population. And I think, again, I'm going to cite Aristovich. He says, any country that, having been multicultural or pluricultural, retreats into a monocultural shell is doomed, is destined to be second or third rate. And that's not the Ukraine, I think, that most Ukrainians want, including most Galicians. I remember my trips to Lvov, and I'm going to say Lvov because that way you can pretend that it's either Polish or
right.
Say Lemberg or Lviv, doesn't matter. But I really didn't sense, except for certain strategic times, that it was all that important to the local citizens to be identified as only Galician. I mean, it was a little bit of a play. It was a little bit of play acting. It was something that they have all these T-shirts going Bandera-Stadt and things like that, which seem to appeal to, again, a certain category of Western tourists and the Western Ukrainian nationalists and their children who still prefer to live in the West, but will send an occasional donation for the cause and things like that. That's really their source of income. But, and it isn't just my experience, but of those from others from Odessa region and who have traveled to Western Ukraine, if they travel and are polite and say, well, we're from Odessa, so we're mainly Russian speaking, we'll try to understand things like that, but we're here to spend money and have a good time on the ski slopes and things like that, people don't have any problems.
That's
I
the
certainly
trick.
didn't speak Ukrainian, or especially the local dialect of Ukrainian, and I was served very well everywhere in the Lviv coffee shops, and they didn't have any problems. In fact, and this stuck in my mind, been several years now. I stopped at a newspaper kiosk and asked for a map of the city, and the woman, who was an elderly woman, she said, "Oh, thank God you're for speaking Russian." I said, "I just missed it, so much."
But didn't you? I think last time you were on, Nick, you talked about the law in Ukraine, according to which you can be fined if you start speaking in Russian. So we're kind of some way away from that. The other thing is that you have to then consider the West. I mean, the West is obviously in the business of fostering divisions. I mean, it uses its political, economic, military resources to foster division. We've seen what it's done in the Balkans. I mean, people who once lived together in Yugoslavia, a reasonably successful state, now hate each other. They can't be close to each other. They're suing one another in the International Court of Justice. They can't live together. This has been a deliberate policy by the West. So it's hard to see how you can go to what you say is a sensible society as long as the West keeps pressing, EU, NATO membership, and so on and so on.
Maybe we don't all have to be part of the West. Now, that's the way of thinking that I think needs to be promoted, discussed. We have a model of the world, a Western-based, Western-driven model that tells us that if we all follow this model of a liberal rules-based order, then all these good benefits will flow. But we have a very good case to make as academics and people living in these countries and observers that those benefits are not flowing from this model. The logical conclusion is, can there be a better model? I was in a discussion, I should say, a few days ago with Richard Sakwa. I want to plug his great new book here, The Lost Peace. And we were discussing, and I think he is rightly skeptical of the idea of jumping away from the existing international structures into the unknown. I agree. We shouldn't, jump without a parachute. But what we should be doing is discussing the various alternative structures that are now being posed by large as well as small powers throughout the world. Somebody was highlighting recently the recent non-aligned movement reviving itself in Namibia. All of this is very interesting. And at some point, I do expect that it will come to some sort of fruition, to a coalescence where people say, well, okay, I think we can amalgamate all of these basic patterns in these 6 different organizations and create one with some real teeth in it. And at that point, it will be very important to consolidate that, to invest in that, and something I'd like to stress now, invite Western countries to join those alternative institutions. Not necessarily that you have to leave one. It's not like a marriage where you can only sort of like be married to one person, but maybe like multiple citizenship, you have this allegiance, which I understand and I respect because you have traditions there and old connections, personal connections, cultural connections. But look at all the benefits that this alternative arrangement offers.
Well, I mean, there is there's kind of a very kind of like meta example of that, but it's a failure. It's the G20. And George and I have talked about it at great length. I mean, there's a G20 meeting and then the G7 tries to hijack it, okay, and to determine what the communique will be and all that. That's another forum that has been completely discredited.
I have an answer to that.
Go ahead.
The answer is you don't begin by inviting everyone, and especially not the West, because they are a gang. They are a gang of, I guess, of 7. And they will back each other in the interest of preserving their current hegemony. So what you want is to actually give substance to these alternative structures first, as I think China and perhaps Russia are actually doing. And it takes a long time. But once that basic structure is in place and can no longer be hijacked by the West because it has the resources and the organization and a clarity of direction that is comparable, perhaps, to that of its Western counterparts, then you begin to selectively invite select Western countries to broaden their security, political, cultural, and economic perspectives.
What happens when Washington tries to block it?
The resources have to be there to offer that alternative. And you know what? For Russia and for a multipolar world could be seen as a silver lining, Russia's unexpected success in standing up to sanctions. If Russia had failed, then Washington would easily be able to say, we can do this to anyone. Look what we did to Russia. But now Russia becomes the poster child for what country with support, resources, and skill can do to stand up to the worst that Washington and NATO can do. And that seems to be increasingly the lesson in the third world and the fear in the West.
But it's very interesting what you say, because the way you describe it, it's kind of I think the thinking of Viktor Orban. I think, you know, what's going on in his mind is that, yeah, well, we're a member of NATO, we're a member of the EU, we're not planning on leaving, but that doesn't preclude us from going to Kazakhstan and signing an agreement with Kazakhstan, going to China and doing a deal with China or Russia and so on. We just pursue our own interests. Now, the response to Hungary has been quite ferocious in the EU, which is basically, let's take away Hungary's right to vote, and essentially Hungary's right to block us from doing what we want to do. Now, I mean, maybe it'll succeed, maybe it won't succeed, but this is the way it's going to be. I mean, Russia can withstand sanctions, but smaller countries, much more vulnerable countries, cannot withstand sanctions.
It depends on what alternative structures are in place, because the confident prediction at the outset, as you will recall, February, March, April, was that Russia would collapse and collapse soon. The ruble would be rubble and all that, and it turned out not to be the case. Now, there is always a transition cost as you shift resources. But if you plan it well and you look at the models that exist, and it's not just Russia, it's also Russia, Iran, which has more than a generation of experience in this, probably Syria, a number of other countries, they are not doing badly. Let's put it this way. They're not doing badly. The argument can still be made from an economist's perspective that they could be doing better were they involved in other alliances and if the sanctions were taken off. But that is becoming a weaker and weaker argument as, again, from a purely economic perspective, we have a puzzle to solve. And that is, why did the models predicting Russia's economic collapse and strategic default over time, that it must indeed, because of the withdrawal of Western investment and technologies and things like that, Russia will be suffering in a whole number of areas. What if that's completely wrong? What does that say about our understanding of the interconnectedness of the global economy and the way in which we really need to start paying attention, not to just the visible aspects of it, but to the currently invisible aspects of it, which seem to be much, very profound and able to be tapped with the appropriate thought and organization involved.
Yeah, but that there's a built-in assumption there that there's something called the learning curve. And I don't see that particularly in Washington, because, I mean, you know, one of the things that I learned watching all of this, and obviously it's very close to me every single day from the coup in 2014, is that you know, when Crimea returned to Russia, everyone was predicting the same thing with sanctions. And I said, no, the Russians learned a lot from 2008 financial crisis, okay? And they started building up capacity to deal with it. And when 2014 came around, they were prepared. And I would even make the argument they were prepared after the special military operation. Nick, we're rapidly running out of time. I want to ask you, what comes after Zelensky? Okay, what's built into that question is that the Russians will not have anything to do with him, obviously.
Regardless of the military scenario, the Ukrainian political elite will evolve, because all political elites evolve and change personnel. So what we are talking about is what many people talk about with respect to Russia. There's not just removing Putin, there's removing the Putin system. And now I think with Ukraine, we have to realistically say there's Zelensky, and then there's the Zelensky system, which is plugged into the nationalist ideology. So I imagine that in the aftermath of any shift in power, there would be a struggle. That seems to be the pattern in any case for Ukrainian politics, as long as it's existed as an independent state, a pretty vicious struggle where the existing group basically flees, often into exile, and new people come to the fore and begin to make money. So I think, I don't know who will rise, but I think that money and the ability to make a profit will be one of the guiding things that determine the outcome and the political system. Because even, and a lot of people have written about this in the alternative Ukrainian press sources, corruption has exploded during the war. It's not been contained. There's no handle on it, and it's apparently always still a primary concern of key Ukrainian decision makers, how to secure their and their families' well-being. So understanding that, you can perhaps begin to unlock the future of Ukrainian politics, because it has been the past and the present of Ukrainian politics.
Well, I mean, Ukraine was corrupt before all of this, during all of this, and given your answer, it will be corrupt after all of this. But one thing, I guess I obviously should have had a more refined question. What happens to this Banderite ideology? Does it survive this?
It will definitely survive it outside of Ukraine, in emigre communities. It will certainly have its devotees within Ukraine. Now, I'm assuming, let's say, that Zelensky and the current Ukrainian government is seen as having been significantly defeated. The Ukrainian nationalist movement and the Ukrainian insurgent army was soundly defeated after World War II. And their alliance with, de facto alliance with Nazi Germany notwithstanding, they found refuge and a way to reconstitute themselves and publish in the West and smuggle things in. So I don't think that's going to go anywhere. That will continue.
But it won't be. But it won't be state ideology.
It might. Probably not if Russia's wishes come true.
Okay.
If America's wishes come true, it will be the opposite. Which is, and then there's the middle ground, which is there will be a nationalist Ukraine and a pro-Russian Ukraine, which are the territories currently under Russian control. And I think I mean, if you read the political statements of the political leaders there, they are, of course, loyal to Russia, et cetera, but they have not given up on themselves, on the idea of reintegrating into what they consider a healthy Ukraine. And that's the thing to remember. Again, history tells us there are both strands of Ukrainian identity.
So you just follow up.
Pro-Galician, nationalist, and Russophile, I would say. Russophile and anti-Russian. And the only way out, ultimately, is to reconcile these two, meaning to allow them to realize that neither is going anywhere and to learn to live together as difficult.
So Nick, you're envisaging something like a Minsk III? Is that
No, it can't be that. What it will be is
I'm so glad to hear that, because George and I go ballistic and we hear Minsk III.
It has to be internally developed, and an initiative of political forces within Ukraine reaching out to Russia to settle this conflict. And then once this conflict, both militarily and a long-term settlement, comes out of the territorial and political settlement, out of a ceasefire. Once that is done, then both countries turn to the West and say, here's the deal. We're not asking you for help or assistance anymore. We're our own people and we're going to defend ourselves. But defending Ukraine begins with reaching an understanding with Russia, because, as I've mentioned a long time ago, no country can prosper having as an enemy a much larger, stronger neighbor, and defining that neighbor as its enemy in perpetuity. It cannot survive that.
But you're still thinking that the Donbass and Kherson and Zaporozhye will be a part of Ukraine. It won't be part of the Russian Federation. And is that how you see the future?
I wouldn't say that. I don't know. But in between strict sovereignty and a loose, permeable borders, there are a number of ways that you could phrase this. Ultimately, a kind of Benelux arrangement might be of interest. I hesitate to go into detail, but I recall in northern Italy, when the Republic of Trieste was nominally independent, again, their sense of the border controls or identity was not strictly defined, and the borders were quite permeable. I would remind people that in 1991, when the independence referendum was held in Ukraine, the thing that people thought they were voting for in the majority of Ukraine was not strict independence, but an independence from the political and economic control, harsh control of Moscow, but still essentially open borders. And open borders with Russia was an extremely popular concept in Ukraine, at least until 2014.
Right. Yeah, no, that's understandable. But it's hard to see how that can work now after this.
It starts with small steps. Small steps.
Well,
So
I mean,
first,
I'm
talking about direct negotiations. The premise here is that Russia and Ukraine have to negotiate directly and close their ears to the blandishments of all the other powers and say, we're the ones here having the conflict. We're the ones fighting. We're the ones who have to negotiate. Once that is realized, the negotiations will proceed. They can come to some fruition, and it should then be enforced because they have the greatest interest in it. And again, not because the West says it should be this way, or China says it, or Iran, or any other country, but because it's in their own interest to do that. And first and foremost, it is vital for the survival of Ukraine. No one's really, I think, seriously thinking that Russia is threatened ultimately by military devastation, short of an unthinkable World War III scenario. But Ukraine has the prospect of the sort of Damocles looming over its head every day now. And it seems to be falling lower and lower on its head with each passing month.
Well, I'm intrigued by what you said, and I think there's maybe it's feasible here. I mean, you can have a strict political border, but I mean, as far as trade and passage back and forth over that border for trade purposes, I think that's a win-win for everyone here. But that would be predicated on the fact that you wouldn't have a overt anti-Russia regime in Kiev, okay, and it would be also predicated on the fact that neutrality and a very limited, Russia would be determined as a limited offensive, or certainly maybe only a defensive a military sector. But I mean, I think when it gets down to people and trade and stuff like that, that gives me a glimmer of hope. But we don't need ideologues to tell us, you know, how dare you trade with a Russian? Okay, that we need to get away from that.
Right. And people who have at various points worked in the Ukrainian government over the past 2 decades very often reach the same conclusion outside of government once they resign, opposite to the ones they held in government. Now, there is also a legal precedent for this kind of intimacy crossing borders. And it is the legislation that the Rhode passed, at Zelensky's insistence last year, on relations and special conditions for Polish citizens in the Lvov Oblast. Okay, they now have, to all extents and purposes, the same rights locally that Ukrainian citizens do. Again, there are myriad precedents in the world for this. Of course, it's all premised on moving beyond hostility to embracing a desire for a mutually beneficial relationship. I'm not talking about Ukraine giving up its identity. I'm talking about Ukraine saving and actually reinforcing its identity by reaching a long-term settlement with Russia.
Well, Nick, this is a really fascinating discussion, and the ideas you've just introduced are really interesting, intriguing. We'll see if people take them up.
Yeah, we'll see. And can I propose? I'm very greedy. It would be really, really interesting if we could have our next time we convene, that we could get Richard Sakwa, because he was on with us recently. The four of us, and George and I can let you guys fight.
we would agree on a great deal, but I found his conclusions in that book to be a bit too optimistic, and I'm still, you know, he's obviously capable of proposing other alternatives that are harder to come to. But I think those are the more plausible ones at this point. There's no going back to restoring the what he calls the charter system of the UN. There has to be really an alternative to it, based on many of the same principles, but nevertheless an alternative system. The problem after World War II was that we didn't chuck NATO and expand the OSCE as an alternative that included Russia from the get-go. And that's obvious to everyone.
Preaching to the choir, preaching to the choir.
Starting with a person that I debated this with, Andrei Kartunov, the former Russian foreign minister. He says, yeah, that was the death knell for our relationship.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for giving us your time. It was fascinating, as always. A lot of food for thought for gagglers. Thank you, Peter. And remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.